Hello everybody and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Morgana here and today I'm excited to share with you this winter wetland scene featuring a handsome blue heron painted in watercolour. I'm beginning today with a piece of Saunders Waterford brand hot press watercolour paper taped to my board and laid flat. I'll pop a full description of all the equipment that I'm using today in the video description below as per usual. The colours I'm using today are here on screen right now. I will also pop a link down there to my Patreon page where you can find an in-depth version of this painting tutorial, which will be shared this coming Monday. So if you'd like to see a multi-part video version of this tutorial where I go into a little bit more detail about how I came to this painting, how I came to the colours and the composition, etc., then please follow the link below for that information. But here we are, you can see I'm just putting in a really nice clean simple background wash to begin with. I'm not trying to get this wash particularly smooth, I actually want a little bit of texture and a little bit of detail. You can see I've got these sort of really soft crisscrossing lines in this really pale colour, and I'm actually really pleased with this because this is just going to form the base for the painting. I just wanted to start with a little bit of colour and movement in the painting rather than just painting straight onto the blank white paper. So to do this wash, I mixed up just a really loose, really light mixture of Payne's Grey and some lavender, and now I'm using some Payne's Grey again with my mop brush to begin putting in a horizon line, quite a high one up here on the sort of upper third of the paper, once again following that rule of thirds, roughly at least. And you can see I'm doing it whilst this paper is still really wet. You can see the water still on it from the wash that I just put in, and this is just so that my brush strokes here will all sort of soften down really nicely and diffuse into the rest of the water on the paper as it begins to dry. So I'm mixing in a touch of lavender with the Payne's Grey and a little bit of cobalt violet as well. I hope that that's coming through here on the camera. Just a little touch. I think it just helps to warm these cooler colours and adds an extra little pop of interest. And you can see I'm just using really loose strokes of the brush just to get this really loose looking tangle of trees and a really distant sort of misty horizon line sort of disappearing off onto the right of the paper. Now, if you're worried that the distant trees you've put in are becoming too dark, this is a handy little trick. You can use a fine brush and some white gouache and add that in wet and wet, just these really delicate thin lines, and that's just going to add a little bit of lightness back into these dark spots and give you some paler lines within this sort of darker stretch of trees, perhaps little gaps of light peeping between the foliage, or as you can see here I'm putting in some wiggly loose branch shapes. Perhaps we've got some silver birches or some paler trees peeping through this darker thicket here. For this I'm using just a fine liner brush. This is a brush from Da Vinci. It's their Tolineo range and it's a size 0, which is a really good size for detail work. And this is how it looks now that it's dry. I've allowed this all to fully dry before beginning the next step, which is to put in the dark. So we're going to put in the dark water on this painting. Normally the water I would leave quite light to sort of, or do in a dry brush fashion to get a sort of a sparkle on it on a bright sunny day, but today I am doing a wintry painting and I want the land around to be sort of bright and white and icy and to really have that cool icy feel to it. So I'm doing the water in dark colours, very similar to the tree line I've put in here along the back. I'm using basically a watered down version of the same colour that I used for the trees, so it's a mixture of Payne's Grey, lavender with a touch of cobalt violet. And you can see that I'm coming at this really loosely as well, trying to keep my brush strokes really loose and quite sort of spontaneous looking. I don't want too many sort of hard, flat, sort of regular lines here, which is why I'm using my sword liner brush. This is my large version of the one that I generally use, because it's got, you can see it's this really long, very springy brush. It's got lots of movement in it, which means that it's hard to create sort of regular blocky shapes with it, which can sometimes be difficult. But for this sort of work, it means that it's perfect to get these really loose, natural looking shapes. You can see that I'm just sort of scraping the full sort of length of the brush along the paper here, really not worrying too much about keeping the marks very neat. Want it to look really loose and natural looking, and following a very loose Z-shape composition for this piece, which is a really nice one to sort of draw the eye across and inwards for landscape painting. Now, of course, if you don't have a brush like this, then of course use whatever brush you have and what you feel comfortable using. That's what this is all about. Personally, I feel really comfortable using these sword liner brushes. I practice with them quite a lot, and they're one of my favourite brushes to use. So when it came down to doing this painting, it's what I picked up because it's what I'm comfortable with. But if you've got a flat brush, a hearty brush, or a mop brush as well, would work really nicely here, as long as you hold it carefully and make sure you just are really loose with it. Get your random sort of natural looking shapes in. You can see here that I'm actually dragging some of the paint down in these strong diagonal and horizontal lines, which is adding some nice interesting sort of detail, these marks across the landscape here, sort of drawing the background sort of into the midground and across here, sort of getting everything nicely linked up. So at this point I'm really just working on getting the right shape, just building up a nice sort of natural straggly looking shape in the foreground here, and adding a little bit of extra colour around the edge, adding in some more lavender and some more Payne's Grey, keeping that colour rich around the edge of this sort of body of water, and then keeping the centre quite pale, so we get that contrast. We get a sense of the reflected light from that lovely pale sky sort of glinting off the surface of the water. You can do some dry brushing here if that is your preferred method as well, but you can see I'm still just using the flat of the brush and just pulling these sort of seemingly random, but trying to keep it really loose, these lovely loose shapes out of that darker section, doing some more of these diagonal lines that I'm really sort of enjoying doing, pulling those darts out and just having fun with it, really. It's the lovely thing about loose painting, is if you can be really sort of expressionful with it and really just go with what you think at the time is going to look beautiful. You can see here I'm doing more of these lovely long lines, got a couple of crisscrosses here. Maybe this is random sort of patterns and cracking in the ice. Maybe this is the marks left by a couple of cyclists, a couple of trail bikers off exploring in that distant wood, you know, that we can't see, who have just left a couple of tracks behind. Who knows? So you can see I am being quite careful to leave some white space here in the sort of mid-left section, because this is where I'm going to put in some final details, including a beautiful heron. I wanted to do a lovely bird in this one, so I left this white space here where you can see now that I've just come in with a pencil and just drawn the basic shape really lightly, got him standing on the edge of that murky water there, probably on the hunt for frogs or small fish or other sort of tasty little morsels that herons like. So to paint the heron, the easiest way is just to make sure you've got a good pencil outline to begin with. I know that some people can feel a little intimidated by the idea of putting details such as this into sort of looser landscapes, but the way to really make it easier on yourself is to go in really lightly with your pencil first to make sure you've got a good outline, and then just follow that with the brush, as you can see that I'm doing here. This works for pretty much all sorts of details like animals, birds, people, dogs, you know, the sort of details that sometimes it's nice to add to your landscape paintings to give them a little bit of life. For example, with this heron, all you need to do is make sure you've got those basic shapes down. So we've got this lovely sort of elongated oval shape for the body and the wing, this S bend for the long neck, that small head and long beak, which is of course iconic for the heron, and those lovely long leggies sticking out of the water there. And beyond that, you know, everything is just dependent on how much detail you're willing to put in and how much time you're willing to spend on this sort of more detailed part of the painting. You can see I'm using exactly the same colours as I used for the rest of the landscape. This is for two reasons. One, because they just so happen to be the perfect colours for this heron. This is a blue heron, which, as the name suggests, is a wonderful combination of whites, blues and greys naturally, and of course that's what I'm painting in today, so that's really kind of useful to already have those on my palette. But the other reason is because I wanted to keep the colour harmony in this piece, so by using the same colours as I've got for the rest of the landscape, I feel that he sort of fits in and blends in really well. And as you can see, I'm literally just going around and following my pencil outline with my brush, trying to keep it sort of looking quite loose and quite scraggy almost. Got a nice little bit of white peeping through there on the wing. Try not to blot out the colours too much and let the pale sort of background colour come through, and that's giving us the white highlights on this bird without having to put in any extra effort really. A fine brush as well is really great for details such as these long sort of thin legs, which can look blocky if you do them too clumsily, so I always switch to a smaller brush for stuff like this. And of course he's standing in this deeper water, which is a darker colour, so I'm going to use a little bit of the opaque white gouache here to add a paler edge to the leg, just to make sure that they show up when I'm painting over this darker water here. So now I'm just coming in with a little bit of Payne's Grey just to add some darks, some really sort of nice dark tones to the top of the bird's head, getting those iconic little twin feathers in at the back there, again using my fine detail brush and just pushing the darks around to make sure that this bird is not all sort of mid-tone paint. We want a little bit of shadow in there as well. We've managed to keep some pale highlights in there, which is really great, but you can see I'm just really loosely sort of scrubbing a bit of this Payne's Grey across the rest of the bird and getting some shadows in there as well. So now that he's all dry, you can see I added in a little bit more dark there to just really make him stand out. And I'm just putting in now some details just to finish off this painting. So along with our bird, we want some reeds, some cover for him to be standing among, and I switched to my smaller sword liner to put these in. You can see I'm holding the brush vertically and just pulling the paint upwards, keeping it quite loose, and getting these natural looking wibbly wobbly vertical shapes. Now you can of course use any brush you like for this, as long as it comes to a nice fine point and you of course feel comfortable using it. Just settling those reeds into the water there, putting a little bit of movement there. Of course you want the water will likely be disturbed where the reeds are sort of poking out and being moved around by the wind, so don't forget to add that in. And then just keep popping them around the painting wherever you think best. For details like this, I like to decide on their placement after I've got everything else in the painting in place. You see how it looks and you see, you know, what it needs. In a way you can sort of take a step back. So once I've got in that big shape of water, that lovely heron, I can sort of look at the painting and think, oh, okay, well this spot looks a bit barren. It's time to put in some details. So I'm gonna carry on and put in a few more. You can see here down on the right hand side, just using exactly the same technique that I've just shown you. And I'm using the liner as well to just dab in an extra little bit of dark water peeping through. Just basically, this is essentially filling the spaces, filling those little hollow spaces that you think look a little bit barren and a little bit bare, and just adding in some really nice simple details that just help finish off a painting and bring it to life. So you can see here I am now adding a little bit of white gouache into my reeds. The paint is still wet, so you get an interesting like colour transition. You get a little bit of interesting diffusion here because the white gouache tends to be thicker than the watercolour paint, so it pools really interestingly if you add them both wet on wet, which is what I'm doing here. Just adding that little bit of lightness into these very sort of dark lines. So I'm just going to go ahead and carry on doing that. Add a little bit more light on the right and left. And now I'm going to show you as well handy little finishing off detail, which is just adding some really faint branch detail in the background here. You can see I'm just going to work my way across these background trees with my fine brush and some really light paint and add in some very loose branches. I'm basically just going to work my way along this tree line. You can see I've done a few more here off camera, and it's really very simple. It's just putting these little fine loose lines across these soft shapes using really loose paint, so paint that's been diluted with lots of water, and you just get this extra little bit of detail in there that just helps bring the painting together. You can see now that I'm actually switched to some white gouache, again used quite sparingly, just in these little thin lines, little hints of trunks and hints of branches peeping through. The gouache as well will always dry slightly darker than it looks when it's going on as well, so don't worry too much about using it. You can see here that it's actually dried really nicely across this top line. We've got not too much white detail, but we've got a nice little tangle of branches peeping up above that distant foliage, which has just really, I think, helped bring that sort of back part of the painting into focus a little bit more. So I'm just finishing off my painting by adding some spatters with the fan brush. This is entirely optional, it's just my favourite way to finish a painting. So you'd see I did some dark spatters before, and now I'm just adding some paler spatters with the white gouache. A little flurry of snow perhaps, or a little flurry of seeds blown up from the reeds by the wind that's whistling across this icy flat. But however you want to interpret it, here is the finished painting. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know what you think in the comments. If you wanted to see the extended cut of this tutorial with a little bit more detail, background, explanations, etc., then please follow the link below the video to my Patreon page. But that's all from me today. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope that wherever you are and whatever you're up to, you have a wonderful rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon in the next video, and happy painting.